All right, and we're live. Hello, world. This is CS50 on Twitch, and I'm joined by
CS50's own David Malan. Nice to see everyone again. Hello to the viewers in the chat room right now.
Yeah, we got a few people in there. We got to see Bavik Knight, Scotty529 says I don't have SQL experience, but I'm excited to learn. Excited to teach some SQL today, or I'm going to be learning some SQL today.
Yeah, Colton's going to be pretending not to know much about SQL, so you can experience vicariously what it's like to learn a little bit of structured query language today.
Sure. Andre's here in the chat. Says hello. Hello, Andre. Good to see you. Good to see Bavik Knight, Zodiac, and New Wanda. That's Asli Turmican from last when we did the concentration games.
Yeah, it's good to see some familiar usernames here. Some of which are a little hard to pronounce since they're not exactly words, but hope you'll forgive just a little wave from us here.
All right, and so what are we going to be talking about today?
So why don't we just talk about databases? We actually in CS50, of course, every semester talk about SQL and databases more generally, but we tend to move through it really quickly. We don't necessarily get too much into the weeds of doing things hands-on, and in fact, even when we do, we tend to use CS50 IDE, but for the more comfortable audience that might be tuning in via Twitch, thought we could play a little more hands-on on the terminal window on my own Mac, which you can certainly do on your own PC as well, so that it feels a little more real-world representative and less classroom-like.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds great to me. Do you want me to move into your laptop on the screen?
Yeah, if you don't mind. I pulled up a little throwback from 1999.
Oh, are we?
Oh, let's see if we're plugged in here. Give us just one moment.
Should be plugged in.
So what you're about to see is a screenshot from a website that I think I first created back in like 1997. I was a sophomore or junior in college at the time, and I was part of the freshman intramural sports program, or frosh IM's program.
I think you might need to. Are you on 720?
You need me to do?
Are you on 720p?
Let's take a look. Pardon me. I'm just going to go into my system preferences here on Mac OS and make sure I'm in the right resolution. Let me go ahead and mirror my display here. All right. Now we have that. Let's go ahead and give you 720p.
Awesome.
There we go.
Cool. There we go.
No movie magic here. Everything is happening incorrectly here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as you see it. No post-production. So what you're seeing on the screen now behind me in Colton is Frosh IM's, the freshman intramural website.
Who designed that great background?
Well, obviously I did, though to be fair, it was probably something we found on Google Images before there was even Google Images back in the day.
How did you find images back then? Were there like user groups or?
I think I had to call someone on the phone to get an image back then.
Send a floppy over the.
Yeah, pretty much. The sneaker net too. Someone would deliver it to you in the mail. Yeah, no, I don't remember where the image came from, but clearly it's all in its 1990s glory here. And at the time, so Harvard for the students had an intramural sports program, which just means sports for those of us like myself who couldn't compete at the varsity or junior varsity or really any level. And it was really just for fun. But at the time, if you wanted to sign up for sports, you would literally fill out a piece of paper, walk across campus, and then hand it to someone physically or slide it under their door, and then you were registered for the sport. So nowadays, you would clearly think that you could at least use a Google form for this. But back in the day, there was no Google. There were no Google Forms, and even then there was no website even for the intramural program. So my first foray into web programming was just to learn it on my own. I mean, I did not learn how to do web programming in CS50 or another class here called CS51. So I was completely self-taught, and frankly, to this day, I think the best way to learn something new is just force yourself to do it and pick it up.
Almost feels like the Wild West of the web.
Yeah, you were alive at the time, I think. It wasn't all that long ago.
Asli says, thanks for remembering my name, Colton. Thanks, Asli, for joining us today.
Yeah, indeed. Good to see everyone, and interject at any point over the chat with questions about this or really any other topic. So we always talk about frosh IMs, not just so that I can relive my glory days, but so that we can use it as a point of departure for talking about where the data actually goes. So the whole point of the frosh IM's website, besides being informational and telling people about the website, about the sports that were upcoming, was to allow students to click a link, type in their name, their dorm, maybe their phone number, although no one really had cell phones back then, their email address, and then click submit so as to register. And at the time, I had no idea what to do with the data once someone actually clicked submit, so I pretty much found a library, which did exist at the time, and I just sent an email to the person who was running the sports program so that he or she could just have in their inbox a list of all the kids who had registered. So this is clearly an opportunity for a database. And what would you have done maybe back in the day if you needed to store something elsewhere than someone's inbox?
Well, probably could have written it down on a piece of notebook paper, but that's probably not a sustainable solution.
No, that's essentially what people did there. And let's see, actually, Andre is noting, back in the 1990s, we used smoke signals for internet transfer. The big breakthrough happened when Morse code was invented. Wow, that's very, very, very very appreciated comment, Andre. I'm pretty sure that's not entirely true for those of you who were born in the 90s or after.
JP guy is rating with a party of 5, so I believe that means, and I'm somewhat new to Twitch myself, but JP's actually brought his channel's chat into our chat.
Oh,
That's
nice.
What the connotation of that. So thanks so much, JP, for that. Dr. Profeto it says raid. Heard you had cool hair, says Tangora. Thanks, appreciate that. JP guy has his emoji there.
No, in fact, we'll be having an upcoming live stream about Colton's hair, so be sure to tune in later this week on that.
Oh man. Gassen, do you want to maybe read some of the other ones up below Andre's there too?
Yep, Whip Streak, nice to see you as well. So what of course might you do with something like this? So back in the day, what I would do is actually store the data not just in someone's email inbox, but in a CSV file or comma separated values, which is kind of a poor man's database, so to speak, whereby all you need to do is to be able to do fopen and then fwrite and actually write the data to a file, and that's it. And it's kind of a lightweight database, wouldn't you agree? Yeah, that's right. So he's not quite on screen, so it just seems like I'm talking to no one there. So, but of course, the problem with CSV files might be what? Like, where's the limitation come to mind?
A little bit less than human readable, I would probably say.
Yeah, it gets a little annoying, especially when you've got more and more words and lines.
I was gonna say if I were to do it back in the day, I probably would have opened something like a text file and just written them out line by line. But that's effectively what a CSV is.
Yeah, you're just using commas to sort of imply that there's a column there. Sure.
Right. Yeah, that's the only thing I guess I could think of would be that it's a little bit hard to do, hard to maybe find things you're looking for. I guess in a programmatic way. But I guess we'll get into a little bit of that.
Yeah. No, I mean Colton's right, because if you think about CS50 or if you have any other prior programming experience, you might have thought about running time or performance, and a CSV file is a file, and files are slow partly because you can only read them top to bottom. Like you have to start at the first byte and read all the way to the end, and then you have to do sort of big O of n or linear search on anything, which can grow, it can become tedious certainly once the data set gets large. So Andre, you're about the same age as me, you believe, just pointing out that talking about the olden days of the internet makes me feel old. Well, you are old. I think you're much older than me, if I may say. I'm just reminiscing about things I've heard about, of course, Andre, but thank you.
I think we missed Gossen's note there. Gossen119 says, is this a part of the Harvard CS50 course?
It is. Well, it's sort of ancillary. So Colton has been taking the charge on leading this and other sessions with Kareem, Brian, Nick, you'll meet soon too, really doing something beyond the scope of the course to have a more casual chat with folks interactively, albeit with us on video and you on chat, so we can explore more topics hands-on, especially.
Yeah, sort of shift a little bit of maybe the load on lecture from coding to doing that here. So we, given time limitations.
Yeah, and so David asks, what's the difference between SQL and NoSQL? So in a moment, we'll dive into more detail on what SQL itself is, but SQL you'll find is a language for manipulating relational databases, and the simplest explanation of a relational database is something that's based in rows and columns, really akin to spreadsheets, but running in a computer's memory, not just visually laid out for the human. NoSQL is not that. It instead tends to store things as documents, so to speak, or as objects, where there's actually more hierarchy and even nested structure. Gassen119, I wouldn't say SQL lacks security. I'm not quite sure what you mean by that. In fact, you're welcome to elaborate here so that we can respond. There are really different data models, so to speak, and different mindsets, and NoSQL has come into vogue in recent years, but SQL is still very much has a lot of momentum still, and in fact, it allows you to model your data a little more let's say, with a little more rigor perhaps even than a lot of object stores do, but more on that.
So NoSQL would be a little bit more flexible, but maybe not as efficient?
It's definitely more flexible. It eliminates some of the pain involved in actually thinking through your schema and factoring everything out. It can be more performant in that you don't necessarily have to rejoin data in ways that we'll talk about in a bit, but really to each his or her own. They can both be used for similar problems. So in MySQL is a very specific implementation of SQL, also called MariaDB these days. MySQL is just one of the most popular versions of software via which you can host a SQL database.
I didn't realize those were the same.
Which one?
MariaDB and MySQL.
I think MariaDB is like the open source spin-off or fork of what has been historically MySQL, but I'd have to dig back into the details in Wikipedia or the like. It coexists, though, alongside things like Postgres, which you might have heard of. Heroku uses that. Oracle, certainly, one of the bigger fish in the space. Microsoft Access, SQL Server. So it's just an alternative, but a free and open source alternative.
Is it the case that CS50 is potentially going to look more into Postgres for future stuff? Is that something you were mentioning in the lecture?
A little bit, only in so back in the day we used MySQL and CS50, and honestly it was just a pain in the neck for students to run not only their own web server on their Mac or PC or in their virtual machine or now in CS50 IDE, but also a database server as well. It's another process, it's another port, it's just another thing to manage. So we actually transitioned to SQLite instead, which we'll use today as well. Postgres is more analogous to MySQL, competitor to it if you will, and we have introduced students to the data types used by Postgres this year because Heroku, frankly, which is this wonderfully free, very easy to use cloud-based service for hosting a web app, it's what they offer. And it was a nice way to sort of prepare students to graduate from CS50 and go off into the real world with one such popular service.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. Makes sense.
Indeed. Yeah, so let's see. Perhaps this has been asked before, but how do you handle big data in terms of SQL or other database structures? Okay, so hang in there for a look at what SQL actually is, but for those a little bit familiar, you can use SQL as well as NoSQL for big data. It really depends on what your definition of big data is, but you'll see that within a SQL database, there's a lot of design decisions that you can make along the way to improve performance, indexing certain fields, deciding how to or not to normalize your database can be a big question there. NoSQL can certainly be used as well. It kind of depends on your data set. It depends on your comfort. And honestly, it depends on if and when you bump up against some actual limitations. Starting with what you know, starting with what you're comfortable with is always a reasonable design decision, I think. And when you actually have a problem to solve, does it make perfect sense, too, to rethink that whole architecture?
And big data, normally you hear like Python and R are big languages in big data. So I'm assuming you can use MySQL with other programming languages too, right?
Oh yeah, I mean those languages are fairly agnostic to big or little data, but the database can certainly be fine-tuned to the size of the data that you actually care about. And this is a can of worms of topics too. You can introduce discussions of replication of databases, caching of databases, views that you can impose on databases. There's so many ways to make more efficient sense of the data that you have. And we'll only scratch the surface surely today, but keep the questions coming.
Cool. Makes sense.
All right. So should we talk about what SQL is for those less familiar, perhaps?
Let's do it. Let's take a look.
All right. So let's go ahead and formulate things like this. Let me go ahead and open up a Google spreadsheet here. Untitled spreadsheet. It's got nothing in it by default. But what's nice about a spreadsheet, whether it's Google Spreadsheets or Excel or Apple Numbers if you're more familiar, is that it lays out your data in rows and columns. And of course, whenever you're using a spreadsheet, like how do you use these rows and columns personally? Like,
I usually categorize I mean, I guess you could do it both ways, but I'll usually have a category of information along the top.
Okay.
So that first row, maybe there'll be a name field and like an address field. And then each, I guess it'd be shifted over, and then each on the left, that column there will be the individual people or the individual entries in the database or my document. So David on the first one, Colton on the second one, and probably the name is duplicated in this instance if we were to just put their name there, but the same idea applies.
Yeah, so the columns each represent something like an entity, so to speak, or a field, and then the rows represent a piece of data, broken out into these individual cells within those columns. So you could do it completely the opposite, like what Colton just said could be completely flipped with rows and columns and rows, but frankly this just tends to be a little more user-friendly in that you can scroll down, which is just more pleasant generally, when you want to look through your data, and you only scroll left to right when you want to see additional fields if they don't all fit on the screen. Yeah, so this is exactly the mental model you should have when it comes to a database, but the problem when it comes to a spreadsheet is when it gets large, like thousands of rows or tens of thousands of rows, like Google Spreadsheets and Excel and Numbers, they're not meant to handle tens of thousands of rows. Like you could still hit Control F or Command F to search for something, but you might get the stupid spinning beach ball or hourglass because they're just not designed to search over huge data sets efficiently. And you can certainly edit them by moving your cursor up, down, left, right, and typing, but there's no easy way other than find and replace to do things programmatically. And so very quickly, or eventually rather, especially with big data, to your point earlier, does it become the wrong tool for the job?
Sure.
So SQLite, or SQL more generally, is a language via which you can read and write and update and delete data, but using actual commands, not just using your keyboard or your mouse, but actually writing code in a language called SQL. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's actually flesh out what we might want to store in this database. You propose name and address. What else might a human have?
Sure, so maybe a phone number, because now people do have cell phone numbers.
Okay, thank you. Maybe an email address, like we said earlier.
Yeah, email address. And I guess it depends on what this would be used for, but we probably could suffice with 4 or 5 fields for now.
Okay, yeah, and let me just boldface these in the spreadsheet, even though this has no semantic meaning. meaning just to make clear that those are our columns or our fields. And then a couple of us will be like the data set here. So I might live at, say, 33 Oxford Street in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02138. And the number here might be 617-495-9000, and Malan at harvard.edu. Whoops. Edu. Let's go ahead and make a little more room here by blowing these out. And then you, meanwhile, might live down the street at 1 Oxford Street, maybe Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02138, 617. We can all go through the same switchboard, 495-9000. And then Ogden at cs50.harvard.edu. All right, so that might be 2 representative pieces of data. And those of you following along online might notice that there's already a little bit of redundancy in here, and odds are you can spot this too. Whipstreak chimes in here. I know this is completely irrelevant, but Colton said to make suggestions, and I would suggest a tic-tac-toe and Lua and Love.
Duly noted, Whipstreak. Thank you. That sounds like something we could easily do. So yeah, take a look.
Yeah,
at
let's
that.
do it. Tic-tac-toe and Lua and Love. Go for it.
I'll do that maybe another stream.
All right, we'll prepare for a little bit of time there. Bhavik, you propose an ID number. So yeah, that's actually a good idea too. The spreadsheet kind of gives us that notion with the column all the way on the left, the 1, 2, 3, but of course those numbers are going to change if we sort things. So absolutely, I like this idea. Let me go ahead and insert another column and just arbitrarily assign each of us a number, generally by convention starting at 1 and then just auto-incrementing its way on up to like 2 billion, 4 billion, however high you want to go. And this is going to be advantageous because SQL is indeed a relational language whereby the whole purpose is to relate data in one sheet, if you will, to data in another. And so we're going to find that this number is actually a nice way of relating data in this sheet to another data set altogether.
Maybe another database where we have courses that we teach, for example, and then you teach a SQL course, I'll teach a games course, and maybe the other database can map the IDs to those courses?
Yeah, so let's actually do that. Let me go ahead and rename this spreadsheet for the moment to, say, instructors. And that kind of implies that we'll have some other tables here in just a moment, too. There is some redundancy, though, here. What would you point out as being redundant?
Probably, well, the phone number for one thing. It's duplicated amongst both of our,
fair.
tables. And the addresses both contain Cambridge, Massachusetts, and 02138.
Yeah.
So there's probably an ability for us to factor that out somehow.
Yeah, and so there's a buzzword in database design called normalization, where as soon as there's an opportunity to factor out common text that appears again and again and again, odds are you'll benefit space-wise by just removing it, putting it in one place once, and then somehow linking the data. Now, this is a bit of a mislead because it turns out in the US that zip codes do not necessarily uniquely identify cities, but for the sake of discussion, let's assume as much. And let me go ahead and create another sheet here called, let's say, cities. And maybe that city is going to have a city name, a state, and a zip code associated with it. But because zip code is going to be a little more important here, I'm going to go ahead and what do you want to put in this table exactly? What do you think?
In the zip code?
Yeah, and what do you want to factor out here exactly?
Probably this, well, I'm trying to think how it would be best to store, because with this, the table itself wouldn't semantically know that a state belongs to it. I guess we could have a states table.
Hello from Cambridge.
So we could have states that maybe get an ID.
Okay.
And then cities that, I guess they could also get an ID.
Yeah, we could kind of continue this pretty deep. So let's keep it simple maybe. And let me propose that, why don't we call this not cities, but zips or postal codes, for those more familiar with that term. Let's just move this column over here just because it kind of is most important. And to your point earlier, let's go ahead and create an ID column as well, just so that we can number these things arbitrarily, but with simple numbers. And let's go ahead and put in one of these zips, 02138. And you already see a potential problem with databases.
You had this issue a long time ago doing something, didn't you?
I did. So stupid feature sometimes, right? The leading 0 disappeared, but here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, we need to have that 0. The fix, of course, is to reformat your data, which is an issue we'll come back to in a minute, as plain text, and now tell Google not to ignore it. And indeed, yeah, when I used to use Microsoft Outlook for email years ago, at some point I transitioned to Gmail and I exported all of my contacts from Outlook, some of whom lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02138, and damn it if I didn't make the mistake of opening the export, which was a CSV file, comma separated value file, accidentally must have hit Command-S, Control-S to save the file, and stupid Excel got rid of all of those leading zeros on all of my friends and contacts zip codes. And so to this day, years later, I'm living with friends who still have 2138 as their zip code because I haven't fixed them all manually.
It's an unfortunate consequence of technology trying to work in your favor and screwing it up.
Indeed. Bhavik, we are indeed moving right now. Maybe try reload if you're only seeing the chat and not the video. We are doing a bit of typing in the spreadsheet, and I think our human bodies are moving a little bit as well. So the database automatically generates. Okay, so David, you're mixing technologies here. So MongoDB is an example of a NoSQL database, and indeed it can create unique identifiers for you, but frankly, so can SQL. And right now, we've not even looked at SQL per se. We're literally just using Google Spreadsheets and manually adding these IDs, but most database engines in SQL can also add these unique identifiers for you. So you do not need to create one manually, as I'm currently doing for the sake of discussion.
And JP in solidarity says, thanks Excel, facepalm.
Yes, indeed, indeed. So let's just finish this up. So if you know that 02138, for the sake of discussion, always maps to Cambridge, Massachusetts, we can go ahead and create a table, a row, just like that. And let's do another one. I know from childhood. Andre, maybe you're in on this with me, even though different country. 90210 is one of the few other zip codes I know, and that's Beverly Hills, California. So we might have another row in this table there, and let's just give these unique IDs of 1 and 2 as well. So what you can do now is notice that Cambridge, Mass, 02138 has a unique identifier of 1. So what we could do is go over to the instructors and actually change the address to be something like this. Not just be an address, but we could have it have a city column, and we can clarify this as just the street address, so that now this is 33 Oxford Street, and then city ID equals 1. And then meanwhile, you, Colton, live at 1 Oxford Street in this story. So your city ID is also going to be 1. Let me go ahead and just left align everything for consistency. And so now you can see that we're storing the same information, but across multiple tables. And so we've made a relationship between the instructors table and the zips table, so that if you do somehow combine these two, you can reconstruct the original data set.
And it's not worth necessarily storing all of the street addresses because there's just so many of them. But there's a smaller but still sizable number of cities and, I guess, countries as well you could have. But zips.
Exactly. We could certainly continue this, and you could certainly factor out Massachusetts and have a state ID. You could factor out country if we'd included that and have a country ID. But at some point, you're just creating work for yourself, and you have to decide for yourself, design-wise, where that inflection point is.
Sure.
So you mentioned before that we teach some courses. So let's add one more table. Let me go ahead and create a sheet called courses. And one will be called, for instance, CS50. And that's Introduction to Computer Science. The other one is nicknamed GD50, which we call Introduction to Game Development. And now these things, of course, should have some columns. So what would you title the columns here, would you say?
So course abbreviation is not the greatest one, but
okay,
maybe
so
course handle.
Handle, okay.
And then course title.
Title, okay. We'll boldface these just to make clear that those are the field names. Let me go ahead and again, just for consistency, create an ID column. And it's okay that I'm reusing 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 again and again because they're in different tables in this case. So now we need to somehow relate who teaches a course to the course itself. So let me propose as a straw man this. Let me go ahead and say the instructor ID for this course is, well, let's see. If I go back to the instructors table, so David is ID 1, Colton is ID 2. So if I teach CS50, we'll put a 1 here. And if you teach GD50, I'll put a 1 here. Let me line everything on the left again. Oh, sorry, I took over the course. 2, so now we've created another relation, this time between the courses table and the instructors table. But, it's kind of a leading question, I've kind of messed something up here. Like, who actually teaches GD? Well, who technically teaches GD50?
Technically, both of us do. You're the leading instructor, I'm the secondary instructor, so there should be 2 instructors in that case.
Yeah, and whoever is who, it feels like we need 2 instructors. So, you know, let's assume that the columns need to be uniquely named. So maybe this is like instructor 1 ID, and this is instructor 2 ID. And that's okay, because then I could come in as a co-instructor, and maybe no one teaches CS50 with me officially, so that can just be null, and that's okay. But suppose that we bring on a third colleague. You know, him or her would need to go in, well, okay, instructor 3 ID, and if, God forbid, we have a 4th person, we'd need another column. And so this tends to be a bit of a slippery slope. If you know only that there's going to be one instructor for any course, super clean. If you know there's only going to be 2 instructors, okay, fine, just have 2 columns. But if you have a variable number of instructors, you could just be defensive and be like, all right, well, let's just go all the way up to instructor 10 ID. But for most courses, most of those columns are going to be blank. So at some point, it just gets a little stupid and inefficient. You're just wasting space and adding messiness to the table. So you would actually then use a join table instead.
Okay.
So what I'm actually going to do is get rid of all of this. Let's not actually put the instructor in the table because of this variability. Let's give ourselves a little more flexibility and create another table here that by convention is typically called something like course underscore instructors, where you have one word from each of the tables with an underscore by convention, but you can call it anything you want. And then you could call it teaching assignments or whatever. So in here, I'm going to have a couple of columns. One is going to be called, say, course ID. The other can be instructor ID. Let's go ahead and boldface those to make clear that there are columns. And now the courses have IDs 1 and 2 for CS50 and GD50. So let's just put that in here, course 1, course 2. The instructors are, again, David is 1, Colton is 2. So we can say 1 and 2. But if I'm also going to be a co-instructor technically of GD50, that's another row for course 2 with another instructor ID, which happens to be mine. And now we have an unlimited number of potential colleagues.
So we don't put the burden of actually storing those relations in the data. It's more like we have a separate database that keeps track of all the possible relations.
Exactly.
For our data.
And this now allows for a many-to-many relationship as opposed to a many-to-one relationship. Like multiple courses could be taught by the same human, or one human could teach multiple courses, or both. And that's the reality here. Each of us is potentially involved in multiple courses. So by having this intermediate join table, so to speak, that literally joins the 2 tables conceptually, can you avoid this problem altogether? And so just to be clear, because a lot of CS50 students make this mistake on campus, you should never be in the habit of adding columns to your database dynamically. Once you've decided on your database tables and schema, so to speak, that's it. You should only be changing them when you want to add features. You should not be changing your schema when you want to add data.
Sure, makes sense.
So we've had a few comments here. So yes, this stream will be available later today on YouTube.
Yep.
Take a look at.
One Bad Panda is hosting us on his channel, which means that people looking at his channel are seeing our video.
Very nice.
So thanks, One Bad Panda, very much for hosting us on your channel. Very much appreciated.
Not a sentence most people have probably said before.
Yeah, that's true. Let's see.
Gasson, hey David, I've sent you an invitation on Facebook. Accept it. I will do my best. I'm afraid we get lots of kind invitations and notes, and we try our best to keep up. So I'll try to catch up soon.
You're at the friend cap, aren't you? You have 5,000.
That's also the thing too. Yeah, you're limited in the number of requests you can actually get. So I have to wait till a few of my friends unfriend me sometimes before I can say hi to new people.
Cool.
All right. So none of this thus far has actually been about databases, but what we have done is create relations among data. The problem is with something like Google Spreadsheets or Excel or numbers, it's kind of hard now to answer simple questions like, Colton, what courses do you teach? Or what courses are taught by David and Colton? Or what courses don't have an instructor? Like for that, you really want a query language, like some way of typing a command in the form of a question and getting back an answer. And yes, you could write macros in these spreadsheets. You could do find and search and kind of copy paste to find the data. But at some point, it just becomes the wrong tool for the job, and thus were born actual databases.
And you can't integrate Excel necessarily easily with a web app.
No, exactly. Especially when you're writing code in some actual programming language, Python, Java, PHP, Ruby, whatever. It is indeed hard to then interface it with a spreadsheet unless you just dump the data as a CSV, which is totally fine. But then, too, you lack some of the dynamism, and it devolves back into linear search and linear time operations.
One Bad Panda, you guys helped me write a game mod that helped my stream. I appreciate you guys. Well, that's awesome. Well, out of curiosity, which mod? I'd like to know.
Yeah, and I'm sure all thanks go to Colton on the gaming front there. So, all right, so let's actually transition the conversation to an actual database. So what do you need to run a database? Well, you either need money to pay for something like Oracle or SQL Server or Microsoft Access, or there's so many open source and free options these days, MySQL or MariaDB, Postgres, and also SQLite. And SQLite is perhaps the easiest, lightest weight way to get started because it's light, it's nice and simple, has fewer features, but it's just really easy to get started. And it also happens to be what iOS and Android are using on phones, so it's also wonderfully applicable. It's not even just a little toy environment. Cool. So how to do this? So typically you can install a command on your own Mac or PC or Linux box called SQLite or SQLite 3, which is the latest version. And if I go ahead and do that, I can specify the name of a database that I want to create. So this one might be called, say, harvard.db if we're making a database for Harvard courses and instructors and all of that. So now you just get a simple prompt like this where you have SQLite as your command prompt where you can actually start typing commands. Now if we want to actually create a table, we're going to have to create a command with which to type to create that table. And I'm just bringing up my little notes because frankly I never remember the precise syntax for creating tables. After that it gets a little easier. But I do recall that it's create, whoops, strike one already, create table, literally. I can type in uppercase or lowercase, but I would say convention tends to be to use uppercase for the SQL commands and then lowercase for your own choice of words. So if I want to create a table that has, for instance, an ID column and a name column and say an email column, and let's keep it simple with just those initially, and called instructors, I can actually do exactly that. So let's create a table called, what did we call it before? Instructors, that has an ID, name, and email. But with SQL, and SQLite in particular, you have to be a little more specific. You can't just specify the column names, you have to specify the types. So turns out SQLite has a few well-defined types, one of which is integer, which I'm going to write as here. Another of which is, actually let's do it in all caps for a moment, integer. Another of which is text, and then we'll use text again for these as well.
To clarify, is everything being uppercase or lowercase optional? Is it case insensitive?
It is optional for the SQL keywords. What you type inside single quotes or double quotes or even backticks is going to be case sensitive.
Okay,
good question.
Sense.
So it turns out this is where SQLite does differ from fancier databases like MySQL and Oracle in that SQLite only has a few data types. It only has integers. It has reals, which are like floating point values, text, which are of course strings. It has numeric, which is a bit of a catch-all for other data types like dates or times, and then it has blob for binary large objects, which is when you want to store just raw zeros and ones in the database. But I think for the sake of discussion, let's actually use some more conventional data types that are more useful in the real world, one of which is integer, say in Postgres. By convention, it's lowercase, but it does not matter in this case. Text is a little ill-defined, so I'm actually going to say something called varchar, a variable number of chars, and this is where you need to make your first database decision, like how many characters maximally might a person's name be? Like how long? Colton. So we could go with 6 maybe.
Right. For a first name.
First name, so last name, Ogden. You know, at some point you have to decide. And we could argue all day long what the possible longest name of a human's going to be, but I Googled in advance.
You know the actual.
It's
you
actually
showed this in lecture, didn't you?
Yeah, according to Google, it's 225 for a crazy long name that this guy named Nick had. But let's just round up to 255, which was just a historical convention. 8-byte value starting 0 indexed.
1-Bit Panda says, Terraria connected my stream elements points system to reward in-game items. That's really cool. It's a C sharp. It's C sharp, right? If I'm not mistaken, we'll be covering C sharp on Friday actually this week with Unity. So if you're interested in that, and if it is indeed C sharp, definitely come check that out.
Nice. An awesome panda. I think that is an awesome username too. Someone should scoop that one up too.
Yeah.
One bad panda. How can we do varchar if we use PHP Lite admin as in mashup pset requirement? So Bob, it's funny you ask. So we are actually in the process now of transitioning to these newer data types. So students who are working on last year's CS50 materials will now see in PHP Lite admin these new data types, not just text. You will now see varchar as of today. You might need to do an update 50, which is the command in CS50's IDE for updating itself, but you should now see these more precise types.
Cool.
Yeah, really nicely done on the C# side. That's a pretty cool combination there. So for email too, I don't really know what the longest email might be in the world. Something tells me that no one really has email addresses longer than 255.
Except Nick.
Because no one's going to email you. So let's just assume 255. But this is a real decision you have to make. And if you've ever been to a website where you try typing in your address, your name, or whatever, and you suddenly can't type anymore, that's quite likely because the database designer has decided, that's enough characters for you. Like you often see this on customer support forums. Like if a company wants to be able to like have customer service, but they don't want you to be too wordy in your complaints or whatnot, you can just cap the number of chars altogether.
Sounds like you might have some personal experience with this.
Yeah, I'm a little annoyed because I've been trying to do this recently, and I like to provide a lot of detail, but they didn't want to hear it. Why does the SQL implementation differ between platforms and servers? I think this kind of boils down to reasonable people disagree. There have been different computer scientists, different developers, different companies who've decided, we can do that better, or we would like to do that differently, or we have different problems that we want to solve. And so while there is this common subset of SQL that tends to persist across all of these various dialects, as they're called, different vendors and different humans have just different implementations.
Kind of why Ruby and Python exist and why C# and Java exist.
Yeah, I think exactly. Like, why are there so many languages? Well, not everyone agrees on what a language should do and how it should do it. So same thing here. It is a little annoying with SQL, though, in that it's all called SQL, but it is platform specific. And this can create problems if you actually want to transition from one type of database to another. Now, frankly, that's probably not that commonly done, but it's certainly one implication of that reality. So let me cross my fingers and hit enter and see if we've actually created a table. Here we go. Nothing seems to have happened, which generally in Linux environment or Mac environment is a good thing. Let me go ahead and now type schema with a dot in front of it, which means this is a SQLite command and not a SQL command. And you'll see just a regurgitation of the command with which to create that table. Okay. Now, how do I go about adding data to the database? Let me go ahead and do that. Insert into instructors. The following fields, an ID, a name, and an email. And the values I want to insert will be one, say David, and Malan at harvard.edu. Now you'll notice I got a little lazy here and I did not put quotes around absolutely everything. And sometimes that's okay. If the words you have chosen for your columns or whatever don't coincide with reserved SQL words, you don't need to bother quoting them. So you can save a few keystrokes. Enter. Nothing seems to have happened, but let's do this once more. Insert into instructors, ID, name, email, values to Colton, and then Ogden at CS50.harvard.edu, semicolon, which is important. Enter. And now, and someone proposed this here, select from where. Indeed, spoiler, so if we want to actually select the users in the database, select star, which means select everything, from instructors, should select all of the instructors from this table. And indeed, you see, it's kind of like a CSV, comma separated value, but it's using a vertical bar or pipe, and you can kind of sort of see a graphical version of that same table.
Okay, so values is kind of like just an expression that has multiple, or a function that has multiple parameters, and that sort of unpacks those to put them into the table?
Yeah, I don't know if it's technically a function, but it's definitely a keyword that needs to be present in order to specify here come the values to distinguish them from the key names there.
Okay.
So a bit of chatter here. So let's rewind here. Why is JavaScript still a thing? Okay, so a little off topic. That's kind of a can of worms. Certainly useful on the client side, and lots of people, increasingly people are finding it useful on the server side via Node.js. Let's see, what else here?
I think Whipstreak and Swarm Logic were making a joke about a SQL injection attack, possibly.
Yeah, you could certainly do that too.
Send a message in Twitch chat.
Let's see, you completed mashup, Bhavik, but I had to make tables locally in my PC. So yes, that was by design. PHP Liteadmin was configured to support only SQLite and therefore only its 5 or so data types. And we have just recently, as of a week ago, enhanced it to actually support Postgres data types as well, but a subset of them only. How can you disable HTML? Now I think you're hopefully trolling us, because that's not really going to happen if you're using the web. What's an integer in the context of SQLite, a 32-bit or 64-bit, or is it dynamic, signed, or unsigned? Good question, Andre. So I actually don't know offhand. I know that in Postgres, this is well-defined behavior. A small int is 2 bytes, an integer is 4 bytes, and a big int is 8 bytes. But when in doubt, let's consult the documentation. So SQLite integer. You'll find that the official documentation is at SQLite.org. Version 3 is the latest. Let's go ahead and here. And yeah, look at this. So Andre, in answer to your question, SQLite's a little dynamic. It'll use 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, or 8 bytes, depending on how big the number actually is, thereby dynamically figuring itself out for efficiency.
That's cool.
I believe it is only signed by default, but let me search for signed. Oops, let's go back up. I saw one hit there. Yeah, it looks like unsigned big int is mapped to integer 2, so something tells me that it's only signed integers from negative something to positive something if it's using an 8-byte value, which I don't know how to pronounce offhand. What else we have here? Can we do a table name like insert into table name? I'm not table name. So Bhavik, do you mean can you name your table, quote unquote, insert into table name? In bracket, oh, I see what you mean. Yes, SQLite does support bracket notation where you can put the table names in brackets instead of using quotes. I think that's what you mean. Yes, that is indeed the case too. Quotes tend to be a little more conventional, but for SQLite, you'll see that as well. All right, so why is this all actually useful? And honestly, this is getting a little tedious. I don't really want to type out all these commands in black and white. So Bobak mentions PHP Lightadmin, which is this free web-based tool. It's written in PHP, but that's an implementation detail that just makes it more pleasant to interact with the database. On Macs and PCs, let me show everyone a really helpful free tool. If you search for DB browser for SQLite, the first hit is hopefully SQLitebrowser.org. If you go and visit that, you'll see a website that looks like this, and you will see a Windows version, a Mac version, and even the tarball if you want to install on Linux for yourself. I've already done this in advance and installed it on my Mac, and once I've done that, you'll see that I have this program, DB Browser for SQLite, and it's actually pretty nice, pretty simple GUI, graphical user interface, for manipulating databases. So let me do this. Let me exit out of SQLite 3, which is the black and white command line version, and let's go ahead and open that same database, which we called what? Harvard.db. Enter. And in here, now you'll see exactly the same information, but formatted in a GUI. And so notice if we actually look at the instructors table and browse the data, we'll see a couple of columns here. I can zoom in here.
Looks awfully familiar.
Yeah, well, we've used it. Oh, what's familiar about it?
Looks like Excel all over again.
It is. So it's a GUI that actually looks like Excel. But we're going to have in just a little bit with Python the ability programmatically to talk to this data.
Nice.
All right, so let's go ahead and actually start over with this tool so folks have seen how to do it here. So let's see.
You can change the colors of the window, says One Bad Panda. Is that a reference? Oh, that's a red.
Yes, no, it doesn't have to be black and white. It's just meant to convey the simplicity of the environment. Yes. Green and black is very popular as well. All right, so let me go ahead and just blow this away and delete this table as unneeded. And let's start over so we can actually see how you can create the same thing. And notice 0, 0, 0, 0, there's nothing in this database now. So let's create a table. Let's call it instructors. And what's really cool about DB Browser is that it's sort of a teaching tool. It will show you what code you could type out manually to execute the same functionality.
Does a PHP Lightadmin also do that?
It does after the fact. It doesn't do it in real time.
Right, that's right.
Yep,
Okay.
when you click submit. So let's go ahead and click add field. And let's go ahead and call this ID. We're going to keep it an integer, and you'll see that these are the finite number of types we talked about before. But you can override it. If you want to proactively prepare to migrate to like Postgres, you could type in something like big int here, and it would accept it. But let's go ahead and go with the defaults. Notice that there's these columns here, PK for primary key, AI for auto increment, U for unique, and not for not null. So primary key is by definition the value that uniquely identifies each row, which hopefully is indeed these new unique numbers. Auto increment is a fancy feature because now I don't have to think about whether you're 1 and I'm 2 or you're 2 and I'm 1. We can just let the database give us IDs.
If you don't do auto increment, will it? How will it? Will it just give it whatever data you give it, or store whatever data you give it? It won't like perform any automatic.
Correct, and you can still manually provide a value, and what SQLite will do is take the next highest value the next time you do an insert without specifying.
So if there's two people, when we give them the ID 1, and we I guess if we try to grab those, it'll just give us both those rows in that case?
Exactly, yeah, that's what we want to avoid.
Okay.
All right, so we see a lot of sarcasm going on here in the chat window. Thank you so much. Hello, Sergio from Spain. What code editor? I tend to use Atom these days. Colton uses
VS Code typically, yeah.
Yeah, so those are two of the more popular ones these days.
They're pretty much identical.
Every face has a meaning. Yeah. Okay, so there's a whole conversation going on. We're going to talk about SQL here on our end. So we've got ID. Let's go ahead and create an instructor's name now.
Gaston did ask one more question at the very bottom.
Let's see. What do we got here? What's the difference between unique and primary key? Good question. Primary key is a superset of unique. And by that I mean primary key means the value has to be unique, but it's also a commitment by you to use that field as the unique identifier for that specific table, and it is a value that can therefore appear in other tables as a foreign key, which is just what we were doing earlier with our table that we called, let's go over to that one, course instructors, where a number from another table was appearing in that table. Good question. Keep them coming. All right, so let's just bang out the rest of this table. Name is going to be text, although we could type in varchar to be more precise with the number, like 255, but we'll go with SQLite's types now. Do I want to make this a primary key? No, because we already have one in our number.
So you should only usually have one primary key throughout your entire database,
yes. Right? Yeah, and it can span multiple columns. You can say that together these two columns define my primary key, but you shouldn't have one primary key, another primary key, and another. Just that violates the definition. What about unique? Should we make name unique in this table?
I don't think so, because two, like John Smiths, for example, very common name, those might exist, right?
Yeah, exactly. And like, God forbid we have two Coltons, we should at least allow for it. So name might be in there. And then let's do one more, email. We'll keep it simple as text as well. That could maybe be unique if you assume people can't share email addresses. So sure, we'll make that unique, but not the primary key. But that invites a good question. You could use email as your primary key if it's already unique, but if your email address is like COGDEN@CS, I mean, it's going to be 10 or more characters, whereas an int is going to be like 2 bytes or 4 bytes. So it's a lot more efficient typically to use integers. So that's another reason to make the primary key an integer. All right, so primary key is how we tell SQL what we intend to use the ID for. Yes, yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it. Are primary keys auto-indexed on SQLite? Yes. Primary keys and unique keys are, by definition, indexed on SQLite and more generally on SQL databases. What's the difference? Okay, we pluck those off as well. All right, so keep them coming. Let me go ahead and before I click OK, just draw our attention to the SQL that was generated for me dynamically. Notice it's using backticks, which is technically how you should escape table names and field names to distinguish them from keywords, but sometimes single quotes are fine as well. All right, so a bit more syntax than before, partly because I don't remember it when I type it out manually, which is why tools like this are nice. So let's go ahead and click OK there. Nice. So we could continue this logic and actually create more and more tables here just by walking through those steps. If you want to play around with DB Browser, I would encourage you to do so. But why don't we actually transition now to maybe some actual code to see how you can talk to this?
Take a look at it.
Hey, love the haircut there.
David says, love your haircut, Colton. Thanks, David. Appreciate it.
All right, so keep the hair compliments coming for Colton. All right, so those of you who are familiar with a bit of Python might know about Flask, which is a popular framework for web programming. It's similar in spirit to Express in Node.js, and it's similar to Laravel in PHP. It's similar to Rails for Ruby, although there's certainly differences among those. But we can go about implementing a program in Python and with it Flask that actually uses a database. But let's start by making not a web app first, but just a little command line application.
Let's do it.
All right, so I'm going to go ahead and open up Vim here in my black and white terminal window.
The other editor that you primarily use, right?
Yes, no, indeed. When I'm in a Linux command line environment, I just pull up Vim. Let me go ahead and open up harvard.py as a script. And now let's go ahead and write a little script that maybe just iterates over the instructors and prints them out on the command line just because, so that we can show how to do it. So we need a way of talking to the SQL database, and there's any number of ways to do this. In CS50, the undergraduate class, we actually have our own fancy library that creates a nice little abstraction that does this for us. In the Python world, SQL Alchemy is frankly quite popular, perhaps too popular for its own good. I find it to be a pain in the neck to actually use. It tends to provide not just an abstraction layer over SQL, also a whole ORM, or object relational mapper, which is convenient in some cases, but it's kind of a whole technology stack unto itself to learn. So in CS50, we use a simpler API that just has one function called execute, which I'll use today just so we can keep the focus on SQL and not on a rabbit hole of Python frameworks.
Does the CS50 library wrap SQL Alchemy at all?
It does. So we figured out how to use SQL Alchemy, and we just abstract that away for students. But we're not abstracting any of the SQL stuff. This is just a Python thing. So let me go ahead and import the CS50 library as follows. So from CS50, import SQL. And after that, let me go ahead and connect to the database. So I'm going to declare a variable called DB, but I could call it anything I want. I'm going to use this SQL class that I've just imported from the CS50 library. And I'm going to go ahead and import the SQL file that we called harvard.db. Not a typo, I'm indeed using 3 slashes there, specifying a protocol of SQLite. Now let's go ahead and execute a query. To execute a query, we can literally type db.execute, and then let me go ahead and select all of the instructors. So select star from instructors, and let's just leave it at that. So just the instructors. And actually, I don't really care about all of our information. Let's go ahead and just select the name of the instructors from instructors. So again, I'm capitalizing SQL keywords and lowercasing field names that we defined ourselves.
So if you select a keyword or I guess a column, it'll default to all. This basically the same thing as star.
If you say that again.
So this select name from instructors will give you all of the rows and all of their names, just like a star, basically, but more specific.
Star selects all of the columns. Name selects one of the columns, but you will always get back all of the matching rows.
Okay.
This function will always return a Python list, even if it's empty. You will get back 0 or more rows by definition.
Okay.
I'd really like to see some good vimrc file and plugins for Vim someday. That is a good actually topic for Jordan Hayashi, who teaches our mobile app development class using React Native. If you look at that course online, you'll actually find that he uses Vim quite a bit and has his own plugins. If you send me or Colton an email, we can point you at that after too. We'll just have to dig up his URL. Is it better to start with Flask or Django regarding the learning curve? So for my part, Flask, hands down. Django is a much bigger beast than Flask. Flask solves a few problems very well. Django solves a lot of problems all at once. And so frankly, I would hands down start with Flask and then work your way up to Django.
And then Brian's course on cs50.edx.org/web goes over both, right?
Indeed, yeah. In Brian's class, we start with Flask and then transition to Django. So you can go to that URL that Colton just rattled off if you'd like to see that as well. Semicolon missing. This is Python. So good question. Within the SQL commands, the way the execute function works, and this tends to be true of a lot of SQL APIs in Python in any language, you don't need the semicolon there. The library will take care of that for us. Okay. What do you think about PostgreSQL versus regular SQL MySQL? So there isn't really, you can't really compare Postgres against regular SQL because SQL is the language, whereas Postgres and MySQL are implementations of the language or specifically of a server. Frankly, I find MySQL a little easier to use. It's a little simpler in parts, but frankly, Postgres has been gaining steam, I would say. MySQL has probably been losing some steam in recent years. We tend to encourage our own students to use Heroku just because it's so simple. They've got a free tier of service. They've got great documentation. And so on those bases alone, the fact that they support Postgres is why we encourage students to pick up a bit of Postgres. But if they had used something else, we would probably encourage something else. Oh, sure. We can repeat the URL. Are you able to type in the chat room, perhaps?
Yeah.
And we'll type in the URL of Brian's web class here. All right, so if we turn our attention back to the code here, this line of SQL, select name from instructor, should give us back a list of all of the instructors. So let's actually store that list in a variable that I'll call rows. And then the purpose of this program is just to print out these names. So let's go ahead and do this. So for row in rows, let me just go ahead and print out row itself, and that's it. And whoops, no semicolon, wrong language. But what do I want to print about the row? Well, it turns out that each of these rows in CS50's library and commonly in these in these SQL libraries is to return a dictionary or Python dict as each of the rows. So I'm specifically going to print out someone's name in parentheses there. All right, so I think I've made no mistakes here. Let me go ahead and save this here. And now let me do a few things. This is using, of course, the CS50 library. If you've never done this before on your Mac or PC or Linux box, you're going to want to do pip3 install CS50, which will install CS50's library. If you have pip installed, if not, Google how to install pip. It varies based on platform. Pip is just a package manager that will install that on your machine. I happen to install it already, so it's already there. So I'm just going to wave my hands at the text there. And now I'm going to go ahead and run Python 3 to make clear we're using the latest version of Python of harvard.py. Enter. And voila, you see an output of all of our names. Now you also see a debug line that's built into the library for pedagogical purposes, just to show you what command in green was sent to the database, and all indeed seems well.
That's handy. I like that.
So what we can do now is make this a little more programmatic. If I also, for instance, import the sys library, thereby giving myself access to like sys argv, I could even do something like this. I could add a where clause, which someone alluded to earlier, where name equals, and then I can put a placeholder. Now normally in Python you'd put a placeholder with like curly braces or whatnot, but in SQL a convention tends to be to use named placeholders like this, and then the library is going to have me do this. Pass in a value for that named placeholder. You don't repeat the colon here. And let me go ahead and say sys.argv one, where I'm going to presume that the user has typed in a word, and then hopefully that's going to filter down the number of results I get. So if I save that and do Python 3 of harvard.py, and now let's go ahead and search for just David instructors. Hopefully, I'll get back just David. And if I do this again, I can just get back Colton. But of course, I don't support prefix matching like DAV. I'm going to get no one because there's no DAV in there. So we can actually show another command. Instead of using equal sign, we can actually say like, and then go ahead and plug in a value here. So instead of just doing this here, we can go ahead and concatenate onto this, for instance, using a plus, a percent sign, thereby saying the name should start with whatever the human typed in, but it can end with any number of characters as well.
Somebody even mentioned it in the chat.
Yeah, I think we saw a percent sign a moment ago.
JP guy, fourth one down, third one down.
Indeed. Yeah, no, very good addition there. So let's try this. So now let me go ahead and run this again. Searching for David. Okay, that still works. Searching for DAV. And voila, that now works as well. So we have the ability to search on a field too.
It's kind of like the primitive version of the Google, what's it called? What's their technology called where it knows what you're typing?
Autocomplete.
Autocomplete. Didn't it have a different name to it, I thought?
Autocomplete. I don't know.
I thought Google had like a specific...
Oh, like IntelliSense or something?
Something like that, yeah.
I don't know. All right, let's catch up here. So SQL Query Python, well, omitted. You can use the percent sign. Yep, okay, thank you, JP guy. Semicolon, yep, not necessary. Okay, can I have a job in Silicon Valley although I'm in Tunisia? I think by definition, no. You would need to be in Silicon Valley, but if you mean can you apply, absolutely. I certainly think you should be able to find contact information on any number of tech companies' websites in California. See if there's a link to internships or jobs, and by all means reach out to it with an email to someone you see online. Or if you have access to LinkedIn.com and have a profile, search for Facebook Recruiter or other such search phrases and see if you can connect with someone, by all means. The world's an increasingly small place and talent is everywhere, so I wouldn't hesitate. What is SQL best used for? So it's a good question. I think it tends to be best used when you have lots of data to store, or data that you want to be able to search conveniently or efficiently, and that may be a relatively small data set. Frankly, even we, for purposes on campus, find it much more useful to be able to type SQL queries to answer questions for ourselves about the students, about grades, and any number of administrative things than it is to like write a program and a script to analyze data or to poke around Excel or the like. So I think it really depends, but the fact that you get the ability to create data sets, select from them, delete from them, update and delete is a pretty powerful toolkit.
Cool. Makes sense.
Can you use SQL with other languages? Absolutely. Pretty much every language comes with certainly any popular language these days comes with support for SQL in the form of a library, including C. So you can use it from old languages to new.
CS50.readthedocs.io, got a plug there.
Well, thank you. Thank you. So what happens behind the scenes when you search? So is this what happens behind the scenes when you search a website? Possibly, yes. If that website is using SQL, which is very possible because it's a very popular technique these days, then yes, there is one or more queries going on, probably using the verb select to find that data. You could, as someone noted earlier, be using a NoSQL database, but the spirit is the same. The data is stored differently, but you can actually search it in the same way. So both of these paradigms are actually quite popular.
We'll be covering actually a little bit of that, aren't we? You said possibly a mini example, like a frosh IAMS example?
Well, possibly. We actually ended up talking about names and addresses, which is fine too.
Okay.
We started the conversation there, but
right.
I don't think we need to port it just to sports next.
Visual Studio's code completion, right? That's right. Yeah.
Is that what you were thinking about?
No, it's got a different word. I forget. There was a specific phrase I thought Google used for their autocomplete feature. Autocomplete would be like the general term for it, but Google had a specific. I'm going to look it up.
All right.
We'll look it up.
In the meantime, do regular expressions in SQL help me to find data? Yes, but they're not exactly regular expressions. The expressiveness of SQL tends to be a little less. You can use a percent sign, as I think the JP guy mentioned earlier, which represents 0 or more characters. You can use a question mark, which is 1 or 0 characters, I believe, or possibly just 1. I forget offhand. And that's mostly it. You can do other little trickery, but it's not nearly as expressive as using something like Python or JavaScript or Ruby to actually use regular expressions on the language. Good question. Keep them coming.
It might be autocomplete, but I swore that it had a different name to it.
Okay, I believe you. So in any case, where does that leave us? So we've only just scratched the surface of this. Let's put together a simple web application just to tie it together to some generation of HTML, but it's really not a hard leap because notice that after all, what we've just done with harvard.py is generate text dynamically by using a for loop and print, but you could certainly imagine using the same kind of code to generate like an unordered list or an ordered list or a table tag again and again and again. So let's actually do that with a bit of Flask code, which is Python code that just happens to use a micro framework, so to speak, called Flask. All right, what do we got here? Aren't regular expressions mostly, I'm not sure I'd say that. They're used in bunches of languages. I learned them back in the day in Perl, one of the earliest incarnations. They're in PHP, they're in Python, they're in Ruby, they're in did I say Python? They're in all modern languages nowadays, certainly higher level languages as well. 0 or 1. Thank you, Bhavik, for looking that up as well. Yeah, regular expressions are super popular and definitely something worth picking up. I can say it's really easy at first to not quite understand how to use them. The syntax can get a little scary. And honestly, just as we preach in CS50, the best way to start building up regular expressions is baby steps. Like just write the simplest one you can, then enhance it, enhance it, enhance it, until you have something crazy complicated that you might not even recognize anymore. But if you document it and you remember those steps, odds are it'll solve your problem. Google suggests, says SuperFX?
Yeah, maybe. I honestly don't remember. I might be tripping, but I'm pretty sure that it was.
Okay.
It had a specific name.
All right, let's keep belaboring that point. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a relatively simple web app just to demonstrate how all this works. I'm going to go ahead now and do this. pip3 install Flask, which will install this framework on your own Mac or PC. Nothing really happens because I did this earlier as well. Then let me go ahead and open up a file called application.py, which initially is blank, and I'm going to go ahead and do a few imports. So I'm going to import from the Flask module something called Flask in all uppercase, a function called render template in lowercase, and a request variable as well. And from the CS50 library, I'm going to import our SQL library again. But you could use SQL Alchemy or the like. We just want to use SQL today. We don't really care what the library is. And let me go ahead and do the following. Let me create a web app using Flask by saying, OK, Python, this file with this name should be initialized with the Flask micro framework, capital F, and I'm going to store that in a variable called app. And let's do the same thing as before with our database. Let's go ahead and use the SQL constructor to say go ahead and connect to SQLite / harvard.db. All right, so we've got two global variables. Now in Flask, let's do the simplest thing possible, define a route. So for those unfamiliar, a web-based framework typically models incoming requests by way of routes, like slash or slash login or slash register, some path with slashes in it that represents what URL the user might visit. And the way to express this in Flask is to say, hey, application, go ahead and define a route like slash, which is typically the default, and then associate a function with any name. I'll choose index because that tends to mean the index of a site below it. And that function now should do something. I'm going to do something super simple. I'm just going to return hello world. So this is not HTML yet. It's literally just a string, but I think it's enough to get the job done because what I'm going to do next is this. I'm going to go ahead and type python3-m and run the Flask module, the software for which I installed a moment ago, and I'm going to specify a global environment variable called Flask app, specifying that the name of the file I want to use for my Flask application is called application.py. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, and you'll see that I screwed up because I forgot the keyword run. So I need to actually type in Flask run. So let me bring this up to a line of its own and go ahead and hit enter. So you'll see a bunch of diagnostic output, the most useful of which is this URL at the bottom. I'm going to highlight and copy that, open up a new tab, paste it, and voila, there's hello world.
Beautiful.
If I view the source of this, it's not technically a web page, it's just a string, but we're one step closer.
Cool.
Now, for those a little less familiar with command lines, this is a little tedious, honestly. To run your web server, it's a little annoying to have to type this whole thing again and again. So there's a few changes we can make here. One, you can export an environment variable semi-permanently. And I can say, go ahead and export a variable called Flask app, setting it equal to application.py, enter. And now until I close this window, I never need to type that again. And I'm also going to set an alias in macOS or Linux called Flask, and set that equal to python3-m Flask so that I never again need to remember that crazy incantation. So now, if I want to do the exact same thing as before, I can just very simply say Flask run, and voila, I'm good and going.
CLI magic.
Indeed. Now, depending on the platform, like Linux sets all this up for you. Mac OS, I think you have to do a little bit more manually. With Windows Ubuntu subshell, subsystem, you might need to do it manually too. I'm not sure, but these are just little command line tricks.
XKCD 208 for on-point regex truth. Did you want to pull that up?
Oh, yeah, sure. Let's see.
XKCD 208.
XKCD 208. Here we go.
Regular expressions. Let's see. Whenever I learn a new skill, I concoct elaborate fantasy scenarios where it lets me save the day. Oh no, the killer must have followed her on vacation. But to find them, we'd have to search through 200 megabytes of emails looking for something formatted like an address. It's hopeless. Everybody stand back. I know regular expressions. Perl, boom, boom, and he's done. Nice.
Thank you for that. There's an XKCD for almost anything in CS these days.
There's some truth there, though.
Another question, what is the -m for? So -m means run a module in Python speak. So somewhere in the file system now is installed a module called Python, and that got installed when I ran pip3, the package manager. So Python 3-m Flask means run the module called Flask. And when I then created an alias, I was able to just remove that prefix because an alias sort of secretly types the same command for you magically behind the scenes. Which language, asks Ameno, would you recommend for getting data out of machines, mostly PLCs and REST in addition to SQL? I started to pick up Python, want to get the data into a database and work with them in a statistical way. So I'm a little less familiar with that particular use case, but to be honest, if you've started to pick up Python, that is certainly fine. You can write a command line script that does kind of the opposite of what we've been doing. Instead of writing select statements, you can instead run insert statements like I did earlier for Colton's in my data, and do that script once, import all your data into a database, whether it's SQLite or Postgres or MySQL, and be on your way. And then you can use R or any number of other environments to actually analyze that data the way you'd like. Is there a visualizer to cut and paste, like Excel, data around in SQL? Kind of, sort of. DB Browser Lite might let you copy and paste some data. Let's see. If I go ahead and let's go into Browse Data. Let's go ahead and create a new record. Whoops, David, and then here, Malan at harvard.edu. Whoops, I didn't apply it before. One sec. David, apply. Let's see. Can I copy this? Copy. So short answer, no. You can't really copy paste easily, it seems, in this GUI tool. I'm sure there is, and frankly, the only reason, well, the primary reason we use DB Browser in the courses we teach here is 1, it's free, 2, it's very easy to use, 3, it exists for Macs and PCs and Linux machines as well. There's also far fancier versions like SQL Pro, SQLize, I think, or something like that for Mac OS, and I'm sure there are others for PCs, so I'm sure there are, I just don't know any, honestly. Visualizer will let you run SQL. So you can get all this by downloading Docker. Okay, so true. You can get all this by downloading Docker. We're not using Docker here. I'm just using little old Mac OS, and you can use the Ubuntu subsystem on Windows these days, or Windows proper. You can certainly use Linux or Unix, but Docker, yes, would allow you to do this as well. But there's no need, strictly speaking. All right, so let's pick up where we left off. I've got a server running. It doesn't actually render any HTML, but for that, we need one other feature of Flask. So Flask supports templating. It uses a language called Jinja, Jinja, which can be used not just with Flask, but with other frameworks. And it just assumes that you have a templates directory. And in that directory, it assumes you have one or more files. Let's go ahead and create an index.html file. That's just a super simple web page, like HTML. Let's close that tag. Let's have a head of the web page, close the head of the page. Let's have the title, like let's just call this my first app title. Let's have a body of the page here and close body. And just let's go ahead and say for now, hello world, but surrounding it with HTML. If now, in my application.py, I want to output that file and not just a hard-coded string, I can use that function we imported earlier, render template, and render index.html. Let me go ahead and save that, go back to my browser, hit reload, and of course, can't be reached, refuse to connect, but that's because I'm not running Flask. So sometimes 2 windows are helpful, so I'm going to go ahead and close this, do Flask run to kick off the web server again. Let me go ahead, though, and go open another tab. So we have access to two windows here, application.py. And now let me go ahead and reload. And now it's working. And now if I view the source, you'll see that I have a full-fledged web page. But the cool stuff that you can do pretty easily with Flask is like this. You might recall from the internet more generally, you can often have URLs that have question marks in them to provide user input, like name equals David, enter. Now that doesn't change the behavior of my app yet, but it could if I do this. If I go in here and I use my request variable that I imported earlier, I can do something like this. Name equals request.args get, quote unquote, name. And if the user gave me his or her name, I can now do something like this. Pass in name equal name, where name is a key and name is a value here that came from the variable. If I go into my template now, I can do something like this. Not hello world, but I can do curly curly brace or mustaches and say name and have a placeholder in this template. Now, if I go and reload, it's not going to quite work as I expect yet. See, nothing seems to have happened, but that's because Flask, like a lot of frameworks, is caching my output from before for performance. So I can solve this in a couple of ways. The simplest is just to stop the server with Control-C, rerun it with Flask run, now go ahead and reload, and indeed you see David. If we now change this to Colton up here, you can see Colton and any other name too.
So I might see where you're going with this. I think we have another iteration potentially.
Ooh, where are we going with this?
Maybe some SQL integration.
Ooh, a little SQL integration. Yeah, let's do that. So let's go ahead now and go into application.py, which is the controller in my application, and just add a bit of SQL logic. But let's take a look here at a few questions first. So scrolling back into town, I think we left off with the LOL before. And then the Docker question. Where can I download Docker for Windows? So honestly, I would just Google Docker for Windows, and the first hit should give you there. It should come up on docker.com. Where can you find contacts on the internet for having a direct job interview for like Skype? Honestly, check, as we mentioned earlier, LinkedIn, looking for contacts, recruiters especially, I'm sure would welcome reach outs as they're trying to identify talent as well. Thank you, Swarm Logic, for the Docker reference there. Lincoln stuff for everything. Thank you.
Oh, right, yeah.
Why do we use Python and not PHP? You want to take that one?
It's a bit of an opinionated answer, I think. I mean, PHP is a bit of an older language now, although it's not safe to say that it's not used, because I think Facebook does still use PHP, right?
Yeah, they technically use Hack, I think, which is their own variation of PHP.
But I think a while back we just all together agreed that Python was just a bit more elegant, better pedagogically. PHP kind of has verbose sort of function names, and it feels a little bit more of a hackish language than Python. Python's a bit more, I think, engineered, I would say.
It's true. PHP has some messiness, but by the time they got up to version 5 point whatever, a lot of that had gotten cleaned up, I think. There were remnants, but it was teaching better design principles, or more modern ones.
I think you expressed that you found it more or less pleasurable using frameworks like Laravel, or I think Symfony was another.
No, I never liked Symfony, but Laravel I liked, even though we never actually rolled it out. Yeah, I mean, honestly, the way I summed this up in a Quora answer was, it was time. Like, the reality was there's just an increasing amount of momentum these days around Python and also Node.js, but that I think is a little too complex for the pedagogical purposes we have, especially given the asynchronicity of it all. Python is useful for not just web applications, but also command line scripts. And yes, you could use PHP for command line scripts, and indeed I did myself for years. It was never really the right language for that, even though you could. It was designed for the web. And I think, too, that there's just a practicality of Python. It's just kind of increasingly omnipresent, and it's not a bad thing for students to have some programming chops in Python. So I do think that its documentation is inferior. I think PHP's documentation is fantastic, especially for newbies. And so we did give that up, which I think is an unfortunate price to pay. Python's documentation is not nearly as accessible or thorough, I think. But I don't regret the decision, I would say.
I think you made the right call.
Oh, thanks. All right, let's see. Really. Hello to Cirez, if I'm pronouncing that right. Welcome to Working on Music, having some issues with the isRest function. Probably a little tricky for us to answer that in real time here, but by all means, reach out on this course's subreddit, r/CS50, or Facebook or Twitter. If you go to cs50.edx.org/communities, if you don't mind maybe typing that out.
CS50, oh, on the, yeah.
Yeah, in the chat, cs50.edx.org/communities. That should give you a link to any number of places you can asynchronously ask questions. let's see, Julius providing, thank you, appreciate you providing valuable content for everyone. National treasure. Oh, thank you, Julius.
We saw it here.
Just for the web and data analysis. Okay, come on, synchronous by. Okay, swarm logic. I don't disagree, but I think for students who have only 2 months prior learned what a for loop is and a while loop and the like, I do think it's a non-trivial step. And so while we do teach it actually in a follow-on class on campus here at least called CS100, Software Engineering in the Arts and Humanities, I'm comfortable saying it's a little too much too soon for most of CS50's students who, again, have just learned a few weeks prior procedural programming itself. Python is cool for non-CS majors also. It's quite popular in STEM, I suppose. Yep, absolutely. Agreed there, Andre. Sure, Anne as well. Suggested something. How did you actually get into computer science and programming, both of you?
You first.
Okay. Slowly, I would say. The story I always tell in CS50 that as a freshman in college, I was a little too intimidated by CS50 because I went here when the course was already offered here, and I didn't take it freshman year because it seemed only for kids who'd been programming since they were like 6 years old, and I was scared away. Finally got up the nerve to shop the class or sit in on it for sophomore year. And honestly, I just fell in love with it. And legitimately, it was the first time ever in 18 plus years of going to school that homework was fun. Used to look forward to going home on Friday nights and writing computer programs for CS50's homework. And that just felt like a sign for me.
Yeah. For me, I was interested in game development. I actually had no idea what programming was. And I bought a bunch of books and saw all this weird syntax for all these sort of like homebrewed programming languages that various game engines in the mid-2000s used, and was turned off by it, but eventually gave it another chance and then found that I actually really enjoyed C and C++ and then other languages in years thereafter. So
nice.
It's been an interesting road.
Yeah, feel free to share your stories too, especially if you're just starting off in programming, how you actually came to find your way here. Minter27, currently doing the final project for CS50 and having a bit of a problem. Can I iterate over 2 arrays that have the same length, I presume you mean? If so, how? So short answer, yes. Depends on the language, of course, but if they are the same length, you can just find the length of one of them, then use a for loop, for instance, over that specific length and index into both of them. But if I'm inferring here that you have 2 arrays that by design have the same length, and you're just trying to line up elements in each of them, odds are that's not a good design. You should generally never have parallel arrays, so to speak, each of which represents something else, but between which there's a relationship. You should probably instead have one array, each of whose members is a struct in C, or an object in JavaScript, or a dictionary, or a tuple in Python, so that you're actually keeping similar data together in just one bigger array, if you will. How do you get into Harvard, asks Gossen. Love to be there for just one day. Okay, so getting into Harvard for one day is very easy. You just come to Cambridge, Massachusetts, 02138. In fact, folks online are welcome to come to CS50's lectures, which are on Friday mornings. Might be a little too short notice because we only have 2 left this semester, and those are coming up the next couple of weeks. But by all means, next fall, next September, if you'd like to join us on campus in an actual CS50 lecture, you're welcome to join. Keep an eye on our social media channels for the invitations and the free tickets for that. You can also take free tours of Harvard, walk around Harvard Square. You're welcome to come through and just see the university itself. And if you go to harvard.edu, there should be a link somewhere to visitors or guests that should provide you with all information. Everyone I met told you that I looked like a programmer. Don't know what that means. So when life gives you lemons, Ace. Okay, so that's fair.
Fitting the mold, so to speak. Oh, that's great. I forget about indexing. Thanks so much.
Sure. Swarm logic. Okay, I don't know if this is going to be sarcastic or not, but here we go. I knew I was getting out of the Army soon, a few years ago. Took CS50X, kept going and hacking, now a software engineer. Wow, that's awesome on multiple fronts.
Yeah, he was here last couple streams I did and was providing suggestions to the implementation.
That's awesome. Glad that went so well, and thank you, of course, for everything you did there and of all the things to find your way to computer science. That's fantastic.
And we knew I needed all the help I could get, so. My story, I'm a translator and had no idea how programming worked whatsoever. I wanted to learn a bit and get out of my comfort zone, and a friend suggested Khan Academy. It was so easy that I could actually get into it, and much like you, I fell in love with it from the beginning. Found free code camp at CS50 afterwards. Thank you both so much for the wonderful work.
Oh, that's awesome. Now I feel a little bad. We're not actually fishing for CS50 stories here. You're welcome to have your own independent discoveries, but that's really sweet to hear.
And that's Ashley who provided the concentration game suggestion from last week. So.
Yeah, keep the suggestions coming. Colton loves to prepare large projects for these streams. So. All right, so I think we should just probably finish this thought because we're running low on time, and we can go ahead and get this little app working.
Sure, let's do it.
Yeah, so I have access here to my DB variable after having connected to the SQLite database. And so really I can select anything I want from this. And so rather than get the argument just directly from the URL, why don't we go ahead and generalize this, maybe Q for query, just like Google does. And then let's use this variable Q in a SQL query. So let's go ahead and say, for instance, rows gets db.execute, select, let's say select name from instructors, where name like :q, and then we can go ahead and plug in the value like this. We can go ahead and say Q should equal request.args.get, it's wrapping because the font's a little big here, Q, and then I can go ahead and just append to that a %sign. And I could clean this up and actually use kind of a templating approach to make this a little cleaner, but for now this gets the job done. But what's most important, and we go into more detail in this in CS50's lectures, always, always, always use some kind of placeholder that's built into the SQL library itself. Do not just use Python's f strings or format strings. Do not just concatenate a value onto that first argument. You will make yourselves vulnerable to a SQL injection attack, which means, as someone alluded to earlier, you can accidentally let a bad guy slip some of their own code into your database, potentially compromising, deleting, updating your data in ways you do not intend. So now that I've done this, let me go ahead and save this and now pass in not the name, but let me go ahead and pass in all of these rows. Let me then go into my template, index.html, and let's go ahead and get ready for a list of 0 or more results, this time creating an unordered list in HTML. And then in there, let's go ahead and do this for row in rows. And now I'm using this language, this templating language I alluded to earlier called Jinja, syntax of which is almost identical to Python, but a little different, like N4 is not a Python thing, it's a Jinja thing. And now let me go ahead and say hello, and then curly brace, row, name, plugging in the 0th, the 1st, the 2nd, and so name that's coming back from the database. So now you see the power, even though it's just scratching the surface, of what you can do with a templating language using Python to get the data from a SQL database, using Jinja, a templating language, to render the data. And so we have all these technologies now talking together. So if you've ever heard the term technology stack, I mean, that's kind of what we're talking about, all this stuff stacked together to produce one final result. All right, so let's go ahead and search for just Colton first, reload. And we didn't, that does look as we expect, but let's go ahead and restart the server. But you can also do this. With Flask, if you pass in reload, it will reload it on every request, but that won't make a difference on your templates. You might have to still restart then or add some code to make that work. Let's reload. Uh-oh. Damn it, thought we almost made it through the stream perfectly, but internal server error means I screwed up somewhere. It's kind of overwhelming at first type, but it looks like unsupported operands type for plus. So I seem to be getting back none from the database, and I'm trying to concatenate a stir onto that. So let's see if we can diagnose this. So that's definitely on my DB line. So let's go into application.py. So let me go ahead and do where name like Q equals request.args get. Oh, you know what I did?
I do know what you did.
I know what I did too. I never changed my variable. So now in a better application where we're not just whipping it up on the fly, we would have some more actual error checking. But recall that I changed the parameter to Q. So let's change that in my browser to Q. Now I get Colton. It's formatted a little differently because even though you don't see the bullet here, there is, oh, I actually forgot the tag is why you don't see the bullet. So let me actually fix this. Let me go back to my template and let me give you your very own list item tag.
Nice.
Let me restart Flask. And now let me reload, and voila. Now we see the li tag. Now we see the bullet. And if we go ahead and search for, say, nothing here, now we get everyone because the empty string matches everyone. And so if we reload here, we see that we indeed now have a bulleted list of 2 people.
Did you end up using the like thing in the lecture demo for the dictionary?
Most recently, I think very briefly, someone in the class asked about it, and I changed my equal sign to a like.
Oh, nice.
All right, so let's see. We can scroll up a little bit. We got a little distracted here.
I think this was the last one we left off on.
Okay, so either of you participate in Hacktoberfest 2018? No, I did not, I'm afraid. Hope Build Bootcamp, nice. Spent some time in college, but I couldn't find what I liked and eventually realized that the answer was right in front of my face on my computer, so I decided I wanted to contribute to the world of programs and apps that made my life easier. That's awesome, fairly compelling. And the lives of others, too. Nice to slip that in there, too. Nuanda, okay, thank you for the qualification there. I think that's on you
this
there.
Is called a kappa.
Yeah. Swarm logic, okay, nice little connection here. All right. It is live, right? Yes, Liberian Warlord, it is live because you're hearing this live right now, probably a few seconds after you type that. All right, Colton's thing's coming up on this Friday?
Yeah, on Friday, and we'll be doing a 3D Pong example in Unity and C#.
Indeed. Bobak Knight, why not Q equals Q? That's because I'm stupid and I forgot that. So yes, that would in fact make this line a little shorter. Thank you. Very well said. I missed that myself. Let's see, live on Friday. Yep, everything's live, and we also posted on demand after. And what else we got here? Whip Streak. Just wanted to say this. CS50 is my most favorite course, especially because of David and Colton. You put in so much work and can actually see you sweating in the lectures. Yes, unfortunately, there's not very good air conditioning in there. I want to watch lectures when I don't have to, and I love you guys because of that. Your not-so-secret admirer, Nate. Thanks so much, Nate. That's really quite sweet.
Sweet note.
I guess keep the comments coming today. We do appreciate it, but you're all too kind.
Seems to be a good temperature in here, though. You're not sweating too much.
Yeah, no sweating here. It's when we're moving around more, and it's under the hot lights of the theater that it gets a little warm. Here we have all LED lights. So, all right, so I think we're winding down. Feel free to chime in with some final questions here, but just to recap what some of the goals were, for those unfamiliar with SQL, hopefully you have a little bit of a sense of what's possible with it. Actually, do you mind going ahead and pasting a link to this past week's lecture for folks who would like an even more in-depth look? Go to cs50.harvard.edu. If you go to cs50.harvard.edu and click on, go to /weeks, actually 2018 /fall,
Whoops.
/weeks /8, enter. That should lead you to this past week's lecture video, which offers more in-depth discussion of SQL and what it's for. It'll recap a little bit of what we did, but using different examples. By all means, to tune in there. Those of you who are following along with CS50 on edX, the final 1 or 2 problem sets will introduce you to Flask and Python and SQL as well. So feel free to tune in there if you want some hands-on experience. And then, of course, in the coming days, do you want to recap the upcoming live streams that we got going on?
Yeah, so tomorrow we'll be joined by Nick Wong, who will be giving us a tour of a basic binary classifier from scratch using Keras and TensorFlow, a couple of open source machine learning libraries in Python.
Nice.
On Wednesday, we'll be joined by Brian Yu, who taught the web course with CS50, and he's also a head teaching fellow. And he will be talking about React, some React basics. And then on Friday, it'll be just me. We'll be talking about Unity and C# making 3D Pong.
Nice. So all this is thanks to Colton. He's been spearheading this whole initiative, building the audience on Twitch, getting everyone lined up to chat about various fun technologies. So props to Colton for that.
And my guests.
CS50's own David Malan, thank you. Bobak Knight, any examples of left in or join? If you don't mind, let me defer to the lecture that Colton just pasted the URL of, where we go into a little more detail on joining data. We kind of set the stage today when talking about instructors and courses, and in that lecture, do we go into more detail on how you can join those data sets back together in a way that SQL really empowers you to. And thank you, Gaston, for tuning in today. We're indeed here live from Cambridge, Massachusetts. You're very welcome, Whipstreak 23. Thank you for the kind shout outs, literally. Any final questions?
Some people just lost their hearing on stream.
Indeed, indeed. Give folks a few more seconds here.
Very fun, Colton. Thank you. Studying
Nice.
Unity to understand Friday's session better. Thanks, Ashley. Looking forward to having you there on Friday.
Can we do a shout out actually to GD50? Do you want to paste the URL, cs50.edx.org/games?
Yeah, sure.
So if you're interested in learning more about gaming from Colton specifically, Instructor ID 2, you can go to that URL there, cs50edx.org/games. It's freely available. Just click the audit option and you can follow along with all the projects there. Nice to see you, David, from Tel Aviv. Hello from Cambridge here. No children here. Thanks for this very much. Is it a major game changer for web? Is it a major web? I mean, for web device. What is a major game changer? I'm not sure I follow. JP guy?
Thanks, Bella, for tuning in today. Appreciate it.
Very welcome, Vahib.
First course, wow.
Nice. Let's see what other final comments come in here. Very nice. Can't quite see the blue text there from far away here, but you're very welcome, London. Oh, WebAssembly. I guess we missed that there. Yes, so WebAssembly may be. So we in CS50 are actually pretty excited about the potential of WebAssembly. One of CS50's former TFs or teaching fellows is actually at Google now working wonderfully on that team. What we are hoping it enables ultimately is to do much more browser-based development in languages besides JavaScript and Python. In fact, we're hoping before long we'll be able to have students coding C in the browser without even needing a server-side IDE or a cloud environment. Hopefully it'll be possible even offline. It's probably a few years away, but we shall see. So yes, JP guy, I think that's all very, very promising. And also for performance, I think, of future applications, where as single-page applications get more popular, they can be theoretically even more performant if they can be compiled down to something more native locally.
I can't read this name on. Oh, Gymnasium was
Gymnasium 88. Thank you, London, as well. Bobak will tell Jordan that you've requested his presence. He works nearby at a startup, so we'll see if he can join us here sometime. Thank you, Liberian Warlord. Also a sentence I've not had to say very often. Very welcome, Munich. Thank you, Gassen. When will David be back? I don't know. I don't think I've been booked yet. So Colton has the schedule packed, but hopefully in a week or two.
Do you want to spoil what we're going to do in a couple weeks?
I don't know what we're going to do in a couple of weeks.
Thanksgiving week?
Oh, no. Let's keep that to ourselves for now.
Okay.
Yeah, stay tuned for an exciting day of relaxation once it's Thanksgiving here in the United States, which is a holiday. Anything else?
Thank you very much. We'll see you soon.
See you soon. Nope, no spoilers.
Yeah, we'll keep that one. We'll keep that one on the DL.
Sounds good. All right, I think we're going to have to log out here in a few seconds. No spoilers. There you go. Apparently, Unity noticed something like 30% performance increase by compiling to WebAssembly rather than the JS WebAssembly emulator. Not surprised. I think that's the kind of potential that lies ahead.
Yeah, I've heard similar. Spoiler.
How about this? Do you know with what button can we stop the stream? Don't hit it just yet.
I have to go over here and click this.
Okay, so how about this? In just a couple of weeks' time, what Colton and I are going to be doing is